All right, we are rolling. We are on our way to see a great many cannons. What a surprise.
Indeed.
And we're going to see a few Turkish cannons.
Oh, of course. I mean, why would I be here?
The only reason you'd come along. We're actually at the Royal Arsenal Woolwich, which in the 19th century was the heart of British military industry. Thousands of cannons were made here. Thousands of cannon shells were made here, and millions of musket rounds and rifle musket rounds were made here. Brett and I have done so much research around stuff that happened here, and so many of the figures that he and I have talked about for many years used to stroll around here. This is where the greats of 19th century weapons development lived and worked. This is the Arsenal, which surprisingly, Arsenal, the football team, was actually founded right here at the Royal Arsenal Woolwich, and they're in the 1880s, 1886, and there's a bronze football for fans of the football. And so both paper cartridges and the Ministry for History are by historical obligation, if not actual football fans, we are obliged to support the Arsenal, the boys of Woolwich. But here at Woolwich, there was the Royal Artillery Museum and the display called Firepower. But in 2016, I believe it was permanently closed, and we've seen a few plans to rekindle some sort of Royal Artillery display. But especially with COVID, there have been setbacks, and I thought, well, we can't visit the Royal Arsenal or the Royal Artillery Museum, but all the cannons are still outside. So we're going to talk about them. And if you're here along for the cannon adventure, there are a lot of cannons to see. So we're going to get right into them with this is a... This is a Turk. This is a Lancaster gun, and this fired a 68-pound shell. These three are Lancaster guns, and they seem to have burst at the muzzle. I don't know whether that was due to testing here at the Arsenal, or whether that was later or during war service. I really can't find much on these particular guns. But we see the VR, and they are designed like Lancaster guns. And if you've followed any of the stuff we've talked about with Lancaster guns, it was a patented oval bore design. It was a very specific type of rifling. They used them in the Lancaster rifle. There were some American applications to it, and now with the Lancaster gun. And they saw some naval service. Guns like this, particularly in the Crimean War, they would eventually be replaced by breech loaders, but that is the Lancaster gun. And we are off to the next bit, and we are fighting two things today. We are fighting the frigid cold, and we are fighting the fact that up here in the north, the sun seems to set rather quickly. And so we're hoping to get as much film today as we can. And here on our next stop is this amazing 18th century gun. This is a demi-cannon, and this was actually made in Dresden. It's a Saxon gun. You can see the Saxon crest on the top with the eagle there. Very early 18th century. This wouldn't have been particularly maneuverable in the field. This would have taken, kind of like siege guns, where it would have taken quite a team to move. You can see the loops here would have allowed it to be moved on and off the carriage. And then there's this large block to elevate the barrel. And I love that this wedge is referred to as a coin. And so you're using the coin to adjust elevation on the gun. It's not as not as sophisticated as even artillery 20 years after it, but it's a beautiful bronze cannon, and it's in front of this building, which is the bronze foundry for the cannons here at the Royal Arsenal. And so inside there would have been all of the large brass and bronze cannons would have been cast. So all British Army bronze and brass cannons would have been cast in this building until 1870. And even in 1870, there are still some naval guns and mountain guns and mortars that would have been brass, even though we tend to think of that as already being the age of breech loading modern artillery. So that is the brass foundry. We are moving on to more cannons in this balmy area. It is quite warm, isn't it?
Yes, it's perfect. You can physically see me sweating right now.
It is actually freezing. What temperature is it?
8 degrees Celsius, which is not too cold, but the wind is not helping.
And it is a long Thames, so we will see. It is a lovely wet evening. 2 more guns coming up before we get to the pièce de la résistance. This looks very similar to one of the Lancaster guns, another burst barrel. I'd say that was probably a Lancaster gun or similar. And then over here looks like an 18th century gun of some sort. A lot of these aren't labeled, but one of the interesting things about these is even if they're on replica carriages, they are on those skeleton carriages that we saw for barbettes. So this wouldn't have been, this carriage wasn't designed to take all of that force into the ground. It was designed to be on barbettes, on rails that would slide it back in a fortress or on a ship. But these ones would be for a fortress. And wherever you go in here, a lot of these buildings have been repurposed. A great many of them have been repurposed, which is nice. A lot of them are residential. We ate in the guardhouse today, and we're going to come up on 2 other guardhouses today. But it's nice to see some of them repurposed. But it's
being used.
It's also interesting that there's
guns
everywhere.
That's supposed to be the museum entrance, the old
museum. So this is where the museum was. Okay. Where it says museum entrance, quite sadly, right there. We are going to go up to yonder museum. Because I actually did wonder whether there would be guns in front of this particular area, but
you served your purpose really well.
No guns. Oh, well, that answers that question. So the next part is where most of our guns are, though.
Guns.
Yes. There is your enemy. There are your guns.
There are your guns, sir.
Attack! 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 Attack what? Attack where? Guns, Mr. Nolan!
There! There, my lord! There is your enemy! There are your guns!
And it's great because there are all kinds of cannon-themed decorations around here. There's cannonballs all over the place. Yeah. But this is Clavel Square. But these are some interesting guns. So the first one here is Victorian. It's actually dated 1854. Has VR, Dieu mon Dieu, and then I'm thinking Trehunct in Uno with a Baron's coronet. This is Lord Raglan's crest. And this would have been a Crimean War gun. Now we see Lord Raglan's crest on there because he was, before the Crimean War, he was Master General of the Ordnance. And that's an incredibly important position in the British military because they are responsible for the Royal Artillery, for the engineers, for all fortifications, logistics, supplies, transport, hospitals. There's so much more that goes under the Board of Ordnance, and so this was an incredibly important position. And some of the great notables of the 18th and 19th century, including the Duke of Wellington after the Napoleonic Wars, were Master General of the Ordnance. This would have been able to hold a sight on the back, and there actually is a front sight, interestingly enough, which is very 19th century. But the next one, with a G3R, this one is 1809. And we see the dolphins, or the handles, on here. And the C here was the second Earl Chatham, the son of Pitt the Elder, and the older brother of Pitt the Younger. And this one is probably the most interesting of all to me in particular. This one is George II. So I see George II, and right there is a ducal coronet with an M. So that's Marlborough, the Duke of Marlborough. And this is Charles Spencer, 3rd Duke Marlborough, not John Churchill, but his grandson. And this one was actually taken from the Royal George. The Royal George sank in 1765, taking almost all hands down with it. It sank really rapidly during a repair. It was the great tragedy of the 18th century. It was the Titanic of the 18th century. And in 1840, there were operations to salvage some of the timbers and some of the cannons, mostly using diving bells. And they even detonated the magazine. It's a scene that's even recognizable today with the Richard Montgomery and the Thames, and dealing with unexploded ordnance all over the world. But this gun was taken back up from the Royal George in the 19th century, and that's a bronze cannon off of the Royal George. Now this gun is huge. And this fired a 9.2-inch shell. There was a breech loader. It loads from the back, and they were introduced. This model was introduced in 1899 and served well into the 50s. It's one of the longest-serving pieces of artillery in British ordnance. Its range would have been 16 miles. Yeah, so this gun defended the Straits of Gibraltar from Her Majesty's enemies.
Russians.
Yes, the Russians. Very impressive. A few more 19th century guns here. This is another large fortress gun on one of those skeleton carriages. And then the last ones here, 2 more Victorian bronze naval guns with quite intricate crests on them. Now I think the P here is Lord Paget, usually known as the Earl of Uxbridge. Commanded the cavalry and lost a leg at Waterloo, and would eventually be Master General of the Ordnance.
My God, sir. I've lost my leg.
My God, sir. So you have.
And another fortress gun on its Barbette carriage. An interesting assortment. But I have a surprise. There are a few more guns. Now, over here, these are two guard houses or blockhouses that defended the Royal Arsenal along the bank. These two are the guard houses. All right, we got our B-roll before it got dark. Got some of our cannon footage, and soon it shall be night.
And the crescents shall rise.
Is it a crescent moon today?
Yes, it is a crescent moon today, sir.
Ottoman wisdom from Jem.
Speaking of which, here we are.
Yes, here we are at the next gun, which I think is surprisingly the most modern Turkish cannon I've seen here in London. Because this is a Turkish gun, but it's a Lancaster made in 1798. So it's a heavier caliber gun, but it was made in 1798. Most of the captured Turkish cannons we see are made from like the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, Lancaster's were developed by the Russians, and they're sort of a hybrid between your standard gun and the howitzer. So it's a little bit flatter trajectory than a howitzer, which is supposed to lob its shell, but it still has a fairly long range. But this is what, Sultan? 1798, which would be my favorite.
Selim the Third.
Selim the Third. And Selim the Third is the one who started the Order of the Crescent. And speaking of crescents, we got both the Tukra and a rather crude Ottoman crescent on there, along with a little bit of graffiti. It's kind of sad because this is almost like a forgotten museum, the remnants of a cannon museum. It would be nice to see some of these a little better taken care of. We need to learn how to clean bronze. But anyway, Turkish Lancaster, very exciting.
Very beautiful.
I'm presuming it's another one captured during the Napoleonic Wars.
That most likely.
We don't have any story with it. Most of the ones here
are from Egypt.
Are either from Egypt or the Dardanelles campaign in 1809.
Oh yeah.
With because we're right over by Greenwich, and Greenwich has the one captured by Duckworth from one of the islands in the Dardanelles during the Anglo-Turkish War. This one here is quite a piece of artillery history. This is a Venetian gun. Now, this type of cannon is known as a falconet, and it's a fairly small caliber. It's probably 1 or 2 pound shot, but it would still have a range of about 1,500 yards. So it's an interesting early gun, and it could have seen service on land or on sea. And it has the Lion of St. Mark, and it says MDL XXI, so 1571. 1571. And that was made in Venice and has made its way all the way to London at the Royal Arsenal. Rather small bore, but little risk of explosion when you have a bronze gun with a small bore.
No, I can see.
All right, we are passing our Venetian gun. We have talked about the Turkish gun, and yet there are more cannons to see and very little light. So we are going to fight for the light.
For the light and the warmth, as this Turkish boy freezes to death. It does happen. What can you do? Really?
If you're cold, they're cold. Bring them inside. All right, what we got is a 36-pounder naval gun, and this is a British-made, cast in Falkirk, And that's very curious because British ships of the line tend to have 32 pounders, whereas 36 pounders are usually French, and so there are 36 pounders on a lot of British ships, but they mostly happen to be captured French ships. And there were some proponents of adopting the 36 pounder, but eventually we have Pike-Sans guns and the shell guns that end up replacing those on most ships by the middle of the 19th century. So we shall continue deep into the arsenal. Interesting here, it's just the remnants of it being quite an industrial area. There's the large door with a giant winch in it. All right, 2 more guns, which I'm not sure if these are all labeled correctly, because that 36 pounder looked much bigger than this 42 pounder, and I do not think that this is a 42 pounder actually, unless Scottish pounds are different than English pounds. But this is another one. This is also a 42 pounder, much bigger than that one. I think these cannons are confused.
There might be Ottoman.
Yeah, there's some Ottoman measurements. Salam is 42 pounds.
Yes, it did.
All right, 4 mortars we have to talk about. This is an iron 8-inch mortar. These ones, not like the Cohorn mortar, where it would have been able to be moved by a manned team. This would have required horses and winches, and it would not have been an easy affair. Also, unlike the Cohorn, this would have been able to adjust the elevation. Not only would you be able to aim by changing the powder charge, you'd be able to aim by changing the elevation of the gun. And these are some absolutely massive bronze mortars, maybe 12 or 13-inch mortars, and they have little shell around the touch hole. But these would have been huge siege mortars. So there are our 4 mortars. I'm sure there are other cannons hidden around here, but that's probably all we're gonna get for today. But there are 4 more things I want to show you. So each of these buildings had a specific purpose. I know one of these is where all the cartridges were rolled for the rifle musket. It's supposed to be a dance studio now. Haven't found it yet. And the one where the football club was founded, that was where the boring happened. It's quite boring. Oh yes, it's quite boring. And this is the Shell Foundry. Beautiful building. Before we talk about shells, I want to talk about 2 cannons before we move past them. This is another Scottish formed 24 pounder, probably a naval gun. It was said to have fought in the War of 1812 at the siege of Saint Sebastian. This one is a French cannon. You know how we love captured cannons. This is another 24 pounder, which was captured on the glorious 1st of June. Lord Howe fighting the French in the Atlantic and calling it a victory despite what happened at the 1st of June. It is the glorious 1st of June. So back to the Foundry. Now that we have rifled artillery starting in the 1850s, a lot of the shells need to be precise, just like the rifle musket ammunition. And so massive steam hammers would have pressed out a lot of these shells. They would have been precisely measured. They would have been uniform. So these steam hammers would have pressed out, just like a small press would have pressed out rifle musket bullets, precisely weighted and to precise dimensions. These would have pressed out massive artillery shells for our rifled artillery, like the Whitworth or the Armstrong gun, or the earlier ones like the Lancaster gun. Now, as we wade through the arsenal traffic here, we are going to end at a rather large gun in the dark here, but it is an Ottoman surprise. This is an absolutely massive bronze cannon from Egypt around 1530, the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent.
Correct.
And while in Egypt, the Ottomans made a great many of these guns. And so it is an Egyptian gun and an Ottoman gun. Mamluk, Turkish, it has a little bit of everything, a little bit of that history here. Absolutely massive touch hole. And then with some beautiful inscriptions on here. Bit of a crack. And then what I'm assuming is quite a large tukra, which I'm sure we could decipher at some point. If I sound it out and then you translate the Turkish, we would be here for an hour, but we could probably do it.
Yeah, probably.
But Suleiman the Magnificent in Egypt, and that is our glorious bronze Turkish gun here at the Royal Arsenal. Well, we have seen a lot of cannons today. What was your favorite?
Well, personally, it's obviously going to be the Egyptian / Mamluk / Ottoman / Turkish gigantic bronze cannon.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see something from the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. You could almost think that, that might have been paraded in front of him.
Most likely.
Yeah. It's amazing to see all the different cannon iconography here. Even here, right in there, has kind of cannon-shaped pillars. I don't know if we can see that, but cannon-shaped pillars. Very exciting. Now, I guess I need to read all the plaques, because this was actually the Royal Carriage factory. And the Royal Carriage department would have made all of the carriages for all of the guns, whether it be field pieces or the barbettes or naval carriages. A lot of them, most of them would have been produced here, including the ornamental carriages that we saw on a lot of the captured cannons, like the Turkish gun at Greenwich, or the Turkish gun at Horse Guards, or the Prince Regent's Bum.
Oh yes, that one.
So
that monstrosity.
Yes, the monstrosity. So even on the way back, I found even more cannons. So we have to talk about them since I mentioned the barbettes. This is a great example of a barbette cannon where this can be traversed. We can move these wheels to move around the gun. So it can be fired out from this position along the river. There's another one over here. And then when the gun is fired, the wheels have been removed so we can't play around with the cannon. But when the gun is fired, it's pulled back. It's shoved back by the force of the projectile along these rails, and then you can load the gun and then move it forward again to be fired. So this is a barbette style carriage for one of those large guns here along the river. Well, that was an interesting day. There's so much to see here. I'm sure I could spend another 2 hours walking around here finding the bits of British ordnance. I have to say my favorite is probably the cannon off the Royal George. I mean, from the reign of George II, the great tragedy that befell it, and then it spends nearly a century underwater, and then in the Victorian era it's brought up. I think that's incredible. In itself, the cannon has a history. I don't know if I've explained it before, but we talked about the stories that the cannons see. That's incredible to me, that you have something that stands the test of time, something that is durable enough to have seen Suleiman the Magnificent, and that we can walk by it today. And then the other half of it is just the industrial part of the industrial technology behind it. Yeah, the production, the technology that the country has to have to make that happen, the people that were involved in it, the supplies, the logistics. There's so much to a cannon. And I think that if you read a cannon, you can tell so much about the country, the military of that country, about the people. I wax poetic about cannon. Yes. Now, I have been wearing this ridiculous ornamentation the entire time, and you have been on 3 episodes now, so I must present you with the ancient and illustrious Order of the Cannon with the captured Russian gun, Crimean War cannon on it. So thank you for being on the channel.
Sir.
Yes, I am Daryl, known in genteel circles as the Lord Rivers. This is Jem, known as Ottoman Reenactor on the internet. Follow us both, and until the next cannon, we shall see you.